All right, moving on. I'm very glad to be able to welcome Douglas Spencer, who is a teacher of architecture and architectural theory, both at the Architectural Association in London and at the University of Westminster. He has published extensively in a number of journals, AA Files, AD, the Journal of Architecture, and his most recent and claimed publication is The Architecture of Neoliberalism, which I really consider, I would strongly recommend as a manual for intellectual self-defense for students in architecture today. It gives a meaning and actual use and work that certain terms that are common in the architectural discourse actually do. So we're very excited to have you, Doug, and
thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks very much for the invitation and for the hospitality. And so, yeah, I'm going to speak quite directly, I think, to Nadir and Libero's book. And perhaps I should just say at the start that the title, Space After Spectacle, is perhaps more decisive than I actually am. So I'd just like to say, to start off with, that I'm not at all proposing that spectacle is entirely irrelevant as a mode of architectural critique, but just that in my own work, in the book that Libero so generously talked up there, I'm looking at the big architects. I'm looking at Hadid and OMA and others, and my current thinking and research is really posing myself the question of how would we have a critical analysis of more everyday architectures? How would we approach a critical analysis of our more everyday experiences of the built environment? So this is perhaps a partial answer to that. Okay, so Andreotti and Lahiji's recent critique is not the first to note that the discourse of spectacle is nearing the point of exhaustion. Jonathan Crary, in his essay Spectacle, Attention, Counter-Memory of 2001, had already observed that spectacle had become a stock phrase in a wide range of critical and not so critical discourses. At the essay's end, Crary questions the term's continuing relevance, asking, are we still in the midst of a society that is organised as appearance? Or have we entered a non-spectacular global system arranged primarily around the control and flow of information? What follows builds upon. Andreotti and Lahiji's critique, here specifically targeted at the discourse of spectacle in architecture, is more forthright. Spectacle, they note, has become what they call the tired mantra of a supposedly critical posture, lazily reiterating its complaints against architecture as image and missing the critical thrust of Debord's writing, without wanting to abandon what remains for them still pertinent in Debord's thought. They suggest Phantasmagoria as a model more adequate to grasping the machinations of contemporary architecture as an apparatus of power and subjectification. What follows builds upon and extends Andreotti and Lahiji's critique while reflecting on the phantasmagoric appearance of contemporary architecture. At the same time, it attempts to respond to the concerns raised by Crary's question around the centrality of information as opposed to image within contemporary matrices of power, subjectification, and circulation. So the discourse of spectacle in architecture builds upon and extends. The discourse of spectacle in architecture is premised on the conception of a kind of cinematic mode of reception in which massed subjects are distracted from everyday realities under the spell-like influence of star architects and their iconic productions. Spectacular architecture distracts in the sense that it concentrates attention on architecture as image, as virtuoso formal performance, as signature style. It flattens the totality of experience into image, pulling focus from the real conditions of lived experience in the city. Now, this account of the reception of architecture, now something of a default mode of architectural critique, is distinctly at odds with Walter Benjamin's critically and more dialectically conceived theories of metropolitan experience, with which it is sometimes conflated. The reception of architecture, writes Benjamin in the Artwork essay of 1935, cannot be understood in terms of a concentrated attention such as that of the traveller before a famous building. Rather, architecture is always, famously, received in a state of distraction and through the collective. For Benjamin, architecture is in fact prototypical of metropolitan and collective modes of reception in distraction. And distraction here is the real experience of the city, rather than some diversion from it. The distracted mode of architectural reception is, proposes Benjamin, twofold. It's both optical and it's tactile. Optically, it consists, he says, in casual noticing rather than attentive observation. In terms of the tactile, architecture is implicated in the formation of habits through which new sensory skills are formed and practiced. Benjamin appears concerned here to distinguish aesthesis, the Greek term properly used to designate sensory experience, from that of aesthetics, understood as a mode of reception in which attention is concentrated upon sanctified and auratic forms of artistic production. Now, this distinction between the two is crucial to his account, I think, of how the reception of the masses differs from that of what he describes as the bourgeois art lover. And the distinction is crucial, especially around the question of absorption. A person who concentrates before a work of art, he writes, is absorbed by it. He enters into the work. By contrast, the distracted masses absorb the work of art into themselves. The art lover's concentration then is antithetical to the distraction of the masses, for whom the current of absorption is reversed. Benjamin's redemptive project is premised on this reversal, on the dialectical wager that the masses might realise the potential of the utopian forms underpinning the dream worlds presented to them within the capitalist metropolis. These dream worlds, arcades, world fairs, the cinema, are possessed of promises of joy and abundance, optically and sensually, that might be reanimated outside of their instrumentalization within and for capitalism. The materialist history of Benjamin's arcade project, as Susan Buck-Morse suggests, disenchants the industrial dream world of commodities and yet rescues the utopian desire that it engendered for the purpose of social transformation. Debord's account of the spectacle precludes, in its very definition, any such possibility. Where Benjamin's dream worlds are dialectically animated through the play of absorption and redemption, Debord's society of the spectacle is a fait accompli. The spectacle, he says, rigidly separates what is possible from what is permitted. The spectacle cannot be absorbed and refashioned by the masses because the spectacle has itself already absorbed everything in real life. Everything, he says, that was directly lived has receded into representation. The current of absorption is reversed once more, so that the spectacle takes up our dreams and sells them back to us, refashioned as objects of consumption and passive contemplation. Even the most radical gestures are subject to this fate. As Crary notes, the spectacle is a new kind of power of recuperation and absorption, a capacity to neutralize and assimilate acts of resistance by converting them into objects or images of consumption. Benjamin's materialist dialectic of enchantment and disenchantment is replaced here by a totalizing conception in which all agency is ascribed to capitalism and none to the metropolitan collective. All community and all critical awareness, says Debord, have disintegrated. But rather than take issue here with Debord on account of his negativity or pessimism, what we should note, I think, is its historical moment, which is very different from Benjamin's. Benjamin's artwork essay is historically and politically located in the struggle between fascism and communism of the 1930s, between the aestheticization of politics on the one hand and the politicization of art on the other, both as live possibilities. Debord's Society of the Spectacle, in contrast, takes aim in the 1960s at a globally integrated system of domination in which the Soviet Union and Mao's China are implicated just as much as is Western capitalism. Evidence for the politicisation of art, not discounting the Situationist International's own endeavours in this field, is in short supply. The range and scope of the mass media, whose industrialised homogenisation of culture is already registered in the famous thesis of Adorno and Horkheimer, the culture industry, has been further extended through television by this time, its putatively alienating and pacifying effects now invading the domestic space of everyday life. What is problematic about Debord's model of spectacle, I think, and especially today, is that it stakes everything on appearance. The spectacle is capital accumulated to the point that it becomes images, as he says. And that appearance is understood here solely as representation. Debord pictures the spectacle as an aesthetics, or perhaps better, an aestheticization of power, where appearance sanctifies existence, such as it is within capitalism. Another famous quote from the Society of the Spectacle: "That which appears is good, that which is good appears." So Debord's identification of capitalism with appearance appears total. Indebted to Feuerbach's critique of Christianity, as Andreotti and Lahiji themselves note, the Society of the Spectacle is animated throughout by an argument suggesting spectacle as only the latest manifestation of the religious illusion, whose power grows in proportion to the degree to which it encourages the subject's disconnection with his or her world. And this observation from the architecture of Phantasmagoria occurs at the point where they are taking on Rancière and Rancière's dismissal of the concept of spectacle. And they acknowledge Rancière's point that Debord is in some sense simply reenacting a romanticising critique of religious and theatrical illusion. Yet Rancière's own position, as put forward in The Emancipated Spectator, is itself found wanting, and I think deservedly so, for its depoliticisation of the aesthetic. But this need not be the final word on Debord's over-identification of capitalism with appearance, and with his conception of appearance in exclusively aesthetic and representational terms. To return to Benjamin, rather than reenacting an existing critique, a critique which in some sense is perhaps even a kind of ahistorical, a critique of religious illusion, he sought to identify what was distinctively novel in the particular forms of experience offered up by the modern metropolis, and to think this through from the perspective of the newly constituted mass subject of this metropolis. If Benjamin's account of experience is worth recalling, and I don't think this is because I want to kind of reinstate his notion of redemption, if it's worth recalling, it's because of this concern for what is novel within experience, and for his stress on the part played by aesthesis, the sensory and the tactile, in the shaping of subjectivity. And I think these aspects of Benjamin's thought are especially pertinent now in circumstances that perhaps even suggest the disappearance of the conditions of experience and subjectification of the masses, even perhaps the disappearance of appearance. Now, the nature and implications of these changed circumstances have recently been thrown into somewhat sharp relief by the revelations and reporting of the part played by the company known as Cambridge Analytica in the recent election of Donald Trump, and too close to home for me, in the successful EU Leave campaign resulting in Brexit, for which negotiations have just begun. Probably you're all familiar with this, but just for anyone who isn't, basically what this company does is they are historically specialists in military campaigns of disinformation who've latterly turned to offer their services within election campaigns in order essentially to offer the same kind of disinformation practices which are enacted by kind of remote surveillance of the activity of online users of such things as Facebook, then constructing psychometric profiles of these, and this is a fully automated process, and then feeding back on a one-to-one basis to each of those psychometric profiled subjects particular sources of information, which may or may not be true, in order to sway their vote in the desired direction. As one commentator said of this, we have no idea what people were being shown or not, which makes it frankly sinister. Maybe it wasn't, but we have no way of knowing. There is no possibility of public scrutiny. Now, this kind of profiling through data mining and the application of big data to commercial marketing interests is, of course, already a somewhat familiar feature of everyday life for most of us, I would imagine. Think, for instance, of one's Amazon profile and its endless personalised recommendations, or of the movement of the so-called quantified self, where we are kind of encouraged to monitor our daily exercise levels, how many steps we've taken, or to monitor the quality of our driving in order to exchange this data for individuated, favourable insurance rates. We are then perhaps already some considerable way down the road towards the non-spectacular global system suggested by Crary in 2001, perhaps even closer now to a system of power organised primarily around the control and flow of information. What the case of Cambridge Analytica reveals, though, in particular, is that power need no longer speak to the masses, nor need it appear spectacular or demand concentrated forms of attention. After all, the kind of information that's drip-fed is not the focus of attention, but might occur in a screen within a screen whilst one's watching television at the same time. And perhaps this power doesn't need to appear at all. After all, I said these processes they go on unknown Absolutely. So you don't know who is sending the information. You don't know that your online viewing habits are being observed in this way. Power no longer, we might say, puts on a spectacular performance, but instead initiates protocols, fully automated processes driven by a computational logic, if X then Y, etc., addressed to each hyper-individuated subject of its machinic data body. This more recent tendency of power merits for some its own equally novel designation. Matteo Pasquinelli and Antoinette Rouvroy, for instance, have sought to capture the contemporary relationship between power and big data under the concept of algorithmic governmentality. Derived from a broadly Foucauldian perspective on governmentality, Rouvroy's algorithmic governmentality is, though, distinct from that of Foucault, in that it claims that this power has no subject as such, nor any process of subjectification through which it operates. I'll just read to you what she says in these terms. Algorithmic governmentality does not produce any kind of subject. Algorithmic governmentality carefully avoids any direct confrontation with and impact on flesh and blood persons. One may even say that algorithmic governmentality simply ignores the embodied individuals it affects and has as its sole subject only a statistical body. That is, a body that is constantly evolving, a data body or network of localizations. But I find the implications of this untenable. If power is now exclusively algorithmic and not at all interested in or invested in bodies, in flesh and blood persons, this would suggest that these bodies, these persons, since they do, after all, continue to exist, do so somehow outside of power. And so this proposition is problematic because it obscures the question of precisely how these bodies themselves circulate and are circulated and mobilised, how they are circulated and mobilised within the physical and material spaces of the city and are subjected as such to the experience of the built environment as an apparatus of subjectification. For the same reasons, I find Orit Halpern's suggestion, made recently in her book Beautiful Data, that what counts now in a cybernetic mode of governance through big data is not the architecture of the building, but only the architecture of the computer program. Rather than conceive of an algorithmic governmentality substituting itself for all previous modes of power and thus rendering the experience of architecture of the metropolis as irrelevant to power, I would understand architecture, particularly the architecture of transit, to come at last to these long-awaited slides, and then losing my place in that. So I would understand architecture, particularly the architecture of transit, as the spatial complement of a larger apparatus of technicity. In turning to address the architecture of transit, the infrastructural spaces of the metropolitan rail system or the global air terminal, for instance, it's what is novel in these, to recall Benjamin, that's worth attending to. And it's in their tactile as well as their optical dimensions, again following Benjamin, that we might find registered their relationship to the larger order of technicity of which they are the spatial complement. And I think what is registered in these spaces as a more or less deliberate operation is indifference. A phantasmagoria of the post-political. This is novel in that it works through the absence or removal of any representational signs of the collective or its culture. In fact, the absence of anything representational at all. These spaces seem increasingly absent as well of any sign that their surfaces are even addressed to their users. They appear minimal, utilitarian, disinterested in their own appearance. They simply are what they are, and are, in short, indifferent. The spaces of the metropolitan subway, and we can think first of all about the Moscow metro, for example, might once have been decorated with images of utopia, or at least with promissory signs of luxury and abundance, the dreams of the collective that Benjamin sought to redeem. But now there is nothing left to redeem, no promise to realise. As Adorno noted some time ago, utopia is a diminishing resource. And, continuing on with his observation, and this is from his aesthetic theory, utopia is a diminishing resource, and existence increasingly mirrors only itself. And I think this strikes a very different and, I believe, more prophetic note than that of Debord's "that which appears is good, that which is good appears," or even Debord's later proclamation that after it's lost its air of innocence after 68, that the spectacular realm of appearance prefers to be feared. I don't think we even necessarily see this either. I think it's more the case now that what exists simply exists, that what is, and does not need to appear or perform to do so. Power is not spectacular. It does not demand concentrated attention. Final few sentences. Yet the cultivation of our indifference is still a kind of production. The removal of signs of the collective, the absence of dreaming, is itself a work of illusion, whose operation has to be occulted and obscured in order for that illusion to function. This is the work of the Phantasmagoria of indifference, a phantasmagoria that doesn't haunt but exorcises the spectre of utopia from the spaces of the metropolis. It teaches us, through habit, in a state of distraction, not to expect much, to settle for what is, for a logistics of efficiency, optimization, and security. Thank you.
Well, again, we have a few minutes for questions. David?
Okay, so why, given what you just said at the end about indifference, why wouldn't we change what Debord is saying about the good in appearance and just say what is boring appears and what appears is boring? Because that seems to be the point, right? Of these kind of like spaces of transit and otherwise. When I walk around those new cities, that's what I feel.
Yeah.
Everything that is boring appears and everything that appears is boring.
Yes. Well, we can say that, but I'm saying that those to fit those words into Debord's mouth is difficult because it undermines the whole notion of spectacle, as we are meant to be kind of impressed with power, or we're meant to be frightened of power.
What he was trying to do, to undermine spectacle. So maybe the moment when we...
I think he was creating the concept of spectacle, rather he certainly was seeking to undermine it, but it's premised on the belief that it exists.
Right.
So I'm saying, what if it doesn't exist? Or what if it's not the only way in which the built environment exerts a power?
Spectacle stops enchanting us, and it's completely an object of disenchantment. When it's completely boring, and what is boring is merely appearance, then isn't this actually a way to undermine the spectacle that we need to fear so much?
Well, the point in my going back to Benjamin, as I said, is not to redeem his notion of redemption.
There's no power left.
But,
The spectacle is,
yeah,
you exercise power out of the spectacle in that way.
yeah.
We're doing what they're doing.
But I'm saying that to go back to Benjamin is, and picking up Susan Buck-Morse's point, because when she writes about, in the 90s, when she writes about Benjamin, she says that she raises this question of, well, what if there aren't any more utopias to even redeem? What if there aren't any more promises to redeem? And I think we're even further down that line now. So I don't see it as kind of undermining spectacle or opening up a possibility of liberation, because I think, and in quite tangible ways, this itself is a kind of production. It is a kind of phantasmagoria. So, for example, it's there in policy, in like the Jubilee line. Some of the images are from the Jubilee line in London, where because of threats of terrorism, the general directives are not to have highly ornamented spaces, but have spaces which are, you can clear them out very quickly, and that they just calm people down. They reassure people, you know, that you should kind of, but then to get architects like Norman Foster in to produce his latest sort of distillation of high tech to meet that requirement.
Doesn't this in the end say that Debord is right when he says the spectacle doesn't want to be loved, but it wants to be feared? I mean, I look at these images and I find them pretty fearful images, in the sense of sort of like the banality of evil. I mean, these are sinister images of boredom as something constructive. It's, I mean, I say that because Debord is, unfortunately, Debord is often taken as a philosopher with a constructive, developed theory, which he never had. But I think the spirit of what you're saying is not fundamentally unlike what his late, sort of very dark kind of vision of society was about. I think he would totally agree with
They're quite Gothic. I mean, right?
yes, it's a
previous-
Gothic, it's a contemporary Gothic, yes.
Okay.
I wonder to what extent you think that also, say the Jubilee line, which is to what extent the absorption in people's screen experience and devices and personal, like, smartphones and stuff, is a supplementary part of, how one can even exist in these spaces, as a kind of anesthetic, as giving you the subway map that's not on the wall, and where that goes in categories.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very helpful suggestion. It's something I've started to think about. But yeah, so in the sense that, so if you took the Moscow Metro or even, Grand Central in New York, people might have newspapers, but they're not kind of glued to devices. So you are impressed by your surroundings. But if you're in one of these spaces, you're going to have your head down, your earphones on. Yeah. So it just becomes a kind of ambient device. So therefore, I think it becomes more about the affective and the sensory and the routine of actually circulating through these spaces, rather than about kind of looking in wonder directly at them. And I think, to be fair, it's also about understanding that there are spaces which very much are designed still to be looked at by the tourist, as we're about to hear. But equally, there are these sorts of spaces which are on the periphery of concentrated attention, really. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much.